The whole reason I got into this episode is I was looking up missing archaeologists after the death of the most recent one. And I came across a photo of a man that was allegedly found in a tomb that was 2,500 years old. So naturally, I had to go digging. And this is what I found.
The ground does not forget us. It only waits for us to notice what it kept.
We think we are observing the past, but we are being observed by it. That sentence is all that remains attached to the name Elon Hug in this story. No papers, no interviews, no photographs. No institutional record you can point to and say, there, that's him. Just a sentence, a name, and a trail of alleged memos tied to something called Project Kronos. You're not being asked to believe this. You're being handed it the way an archaeologist is handed a patch of disturbed soil and told to reconstruct a building from the stain. Elon Hug is a field archaeologist in the mid-20th century. Not famous, not celebrated, and not cited. He's the kind of professional who spends more time in dust and in the sun than he would in lecture halls. The kind of person who is known to a handful of colleagues as meticulous, quiet, and slightly strange in a way. He's said to have had a habit that at first looked like intuition, and later looked like something else entirely. Before a site was excavated, Hug would sketch what he believed was beneath the surface. Not vague guesses, but layouts, corridors, chambers, voids, stone rings, negative space where structures once stood. At multiple digs, those sketches reportedly matched what crews later uncovered. Not perfectly, not magically, but consistently enough that the pattern stopped feeling like luck. It became a quiet reputation. If Hug stood on flat ground and drew, you paid attention. That pattern in the story is what brings his name into the orbit of Project Kronos. Kronos is described as a small, short-lived research initiative that sat somewhere between archaeology, geophysics, and early signal analysis. Its core idea is simple enough to sound scientific and unsettling enough to feel wrong. You can't travel through time, but time might be recorded in matter. Sediment as storage, stone as memory, stratigraphy as a stack of moments pressed into the earth. Archaeologists already think this way, in a sense. They read layers of soil and reconstruct entire settlements. Geologists read millions of years from bands of rock. Kronos, in this story, takes that logic one step further and asks a question that is just barely outside the comfort zone of accepted science. What if those layers don't imply the past, but in some way retain it? Not spiritually, not mystically, instrumentally. What if human activity leaves a measurable imprint in geology, the way a magnet leaves a trace on tape? They don't recruit Hug because he's famous. They recruit him because he already behaves as if the ground is readable in that way. He's the perfect candidate because he's brilliant and at the same time ignorable. The story centers on a dig referred to only as Site Theta. No location, no map. just a name that sounds like a placeholder for somewhere you're not meant to ask about. Before excavation begins, Hug sketches a circular stone arrangement, a narrow corridor, and a central chamber with no roof. The team humors him. Then they dig. The drawing matches what they uncovered closely enough to unsettle people who are used to coincidence and statistical flukes. Engineers attached to Kronos begin running the instruments across the exposed stone and report something that becomes the hinge of the entire myth. They claim the chamber has a faint second outline, a geometry that does not match erosion patterns or the current state of the ruin, as if the room once had a slightly different shape that is still detectable in some way. They give this a name that sounds technical. It's enough to be real and vague enough to be meaningless. A chronoresidual. Hug calls it something else. He calls it the past, with the volume turned down. The story turns from strange to uncomfortable. Hug begins reporting physical symptoms at the site. Nosebleeds, vertigo, a feeling of pressure in the air. He repeats a phrase that shows up again and again in the alleged logs. It's louder in the past. He describes activity in the chamber. Not ghosts, not visions. Activity, work, movement, coordinated behavior. He points to a section of the chamber and says part of it collapsed along an eastern lip. That section has not yet been excavated. When they dig there, they find evidence of a collapse. At this point, the focus of the documentation shifts. The site becomes secondary. Hug becomes primary. Internal notes in the lore begin to describe changes in his behavior. He finishes colleagues' sentences. He predicts small events minutes before they occur. He sketches artifacts that have not yet been uncovered. Some of those artifacts are later found deeper in the site. Some never appear at all. A phrase begins to appear next to his name. Temporal contamination symptoms. He repeatedly draws a symbol that is not present anywhere in the chamber. Linguists are brought in and cannot match it to any known script. When asked what it means, Hug reportedly says, "It's not writing, it's a warning." When pressed about what it warns against, he answers, "Us." That is when his access to site data is revoked. Shortly after, an order appears in the story that ends the entire episode. Immediate suspension of activity at Theta. Backfill the site to original grade. Archive all materials under restricted classification. The chamber is buried again. Not to protect it, but to quiet it. After this, the trail goes cold. Hug is described as having suffered a breakdown. There are no public papers, no interviews, no scandal, just quiet removal. Project Kronos itself is said to shut down within a year. Personnel reassigned, files archived, nothing left that can be publicly verified. This is why, in the story, you have never heard of any of this. Not because it was disproven, not because it was exposed, but because it was smothered in the most effective way possible: silence and paperwork. The reason this myth lingers is not because it offers proof. It's because it sits uncomfortably close to things we already accept as real. Archaeologists reconstruct invisible worlds from fragments. They infer entire buildings from discolorations in soil. Geologists read deep time from layers of rock. Physics suggests that information is not easily destroyed, only transformed. Human beings experience deja vu, pattern recognition, and intuition that can look like prediction from the outside. This story braids those truths together and nudges them half step further than they are supposed to go. What if excavation is not only uncovering objects, but listening? What if ruins are not dead places, but recordings? What if the reason Hug could sketch what was beneath the ground was not because he was predicting what had been there, but because in some strange way, he was recalling it? And what if that process worked both ways? What if, as you dig into the past presses back? The last line attributed to Hug is the one that refuses to die. We think we are observing the past, but we are being observed by it. I'm not asking you to accept this as history. If times were recorded in the earth, if human activity left an imprint deeper than we understand, if excavation were a form of listening, what would you expect to find if you dug deep enough? And once you found it, would you tell anyone? Or would you quietly bury it back again, backfill the site, file the paperwork, and let the ground keep its memory? All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next one.